Hello everybody. Welcome back. Here we're going to talk about interviews today. This should help you with your at-home assignment number 19. Number 9. That was wishful thinking, huh? Say hello to Desi. Here's Desi. He's a big ball of fluff. Desi is actually related to Archie very remotely. I guess Archie's grandmother would be Desi's mother, just in case you were wondering. So here's Desi, and I named Desi Desi for the I Love Lucy show. Desi Arnaz, that character, in the episode where Lucy has a baby, Desi, the band leader, has to do a kind of Pacific native voodoo number, and he shows up at the hospital in his full costume and scares the shit out of everyone. And that reminds me of Desi, so here's Desi. And you want to get down now, don't you? Yes, you don't look happy. Alright, so there you go. Annika just went by. Cats are in motion, so that's that. So let's get ready. Let's talk about it. By the way, I enjoyed our little chat today via Zoom, so we'll keep doing that every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 a.m. Let's talk about the next assignment then, and interview versus coin toss. What does that mean? Well, when we talk about interviews, remember, traditional interviews really rely on gut judgment, and a lot of people love their gut, especially people in power, because their gut's bigger than everyone else's, and they can force their will on people. What we're about, though, is empirical research, doing it empirically. So what do we know? Traditional interviews are subject to impression management skills of candidates, and the danger here is who can best manipulate their impression. People who are high in self-monitoring can adapt to situations quite readily. Psychopaths are usually pretty damn good at this, so why are we using a system that in fact favors people that we don't probably want to hire? Traditional interviews do little to minimize implicit bias, so if I'm just sitting there shooting from the hip, I might be asking different questions of different candidates that reflect my implicit, my non-conscious bias, and I'm not even aware that I'm doing it. And the bias that we've talked about, I know early in the course, but let's reiterate it at this point, is the just like me bias. And who are the best people in the world? Well, obviously the people who are frickin' just like me, right? So that is not what we're necessarily looking for in this context, right? So what are the steps in crafting a structured interview? And notice I pulled this straight out of your textbook, right? For the job requirements to be measured in the structured interview, identify the actions, behaviors that illustrate each qualification. So I don't know what you want to use from your assignment. We use the teaching example, and you guys have good background on that, and you have a good list of KSAs that you built, but we've done that in other assignments as well, so we were going to leave the job up to you in that assignment basically. So we got to identify the actions that illustrate each qualification, and then we have to craft a question that really elicits a person's knowledge, skills, or abilities within a given domain, within a given person specification that we've already identified through all the procedures we've looked at so far. What do people with good and bad leadership skills do? And notice that when you prepared your assignment for teaching, you were clearly able to identify what good teachers do and what less than good teachers do. So you start tapping into those specific items as you've already highlighted, right? What does that look like? And then imagine, how can I ask a question that will tell me how the person stands on this? Now, notice that work product is really probably a better way to go than interviews. Rather than ask someone what they think about something or how they would do something, if you can craft a situation in a testing, in a testing paradigm to actually get at the skill rather than asking about someone talking about the skill, you're going to be better off. But I know we love interviews. Candidates expect to be interviewed. Let's make those interviews as useful as possible. So write questions that will generate relevant information to the degree that a candidate possesses that ability that meets that requirement. Create an answer key, right? And this is the big overview, with benchmark responses for at least high, middle, and low scores on the scale. That would be a 1, 2, 3 scale, which is employable. I've asked you in the assignment to use a 1 through 5 rubric scale. Weight the benchmark response based on the importance of each question relative to the others. So if you're going to ask, let's say, 5 to 7 questions in your structured interview, have an idea which are the most important. Be able to rank order those. And once you rank order them, then you can go back and look at the rank order and then design percentages as to how much each question should be weighted. Or they could be weighted evenly if you so choose, right? Select and train interviewers to increase the interview standardization, reliability, and validity. As I suggested in our little talk, you might not be doing the interview, you might be crafting the interview and someone else will be employing the interview. To the extent that it can be standardized in the way it's presented, the way it's scored, is going to increase the reliability, and that's a benefit to all the candidates. Right? And evaluate the effectiveness of the structured interview in terms of its validity. You want to understand the reactions of stakeholders, including how fair and job related they perceived it to be. So this is going to be something you can ask your candidates, or have even a brief questionnaire that can tap into this later in the process. Maybe post-hiring, if you will. That can help you determine spillover effects. Lots of different ways to get at that. And also I stress this longitudinal. Hey, this was the interviewer's scores. We hired the person on the basis of those scores. This was supposed to predict these elements of performance on the job. Is there a significant correlation between how the interview was scored, that is, high quality answers to the interview questions? Do they actually then demonstrate observed high quality in the performance that the interview questions were designed to elicit information about? So types of structured interviews, and remember in the assignment I'm expecting at least one example of each depending on the number of members on your team. Behavioral interviews use information about the applicant has done in the past to predict future behaviors, and this is what rule number 1 or number 2 in my world of psychology: the best predictor of future behavior, you got it, past behavior. So these are behavioral interviews that tap into behaviors. Situational interviews ask people how they might react to hypothetical situations. And they don't have to be all that hypothetical. They can be genuine situations that were assessed via, way back when we were talking about discussing the job, the critical incident technique is a gold mine here, especially for looking at really impactful situations, and how they were handled well or how they were handled poorly can generate a really nice hypothetical interview scenario. Right? And case interviews, give the candidate a situation, a problem, or a challenge, and ask him to address and resolve it. All right, so whatever the situation that we found through job analysis and person specifications that this applicant in that position should have to handle. All three outperform unstructured interviews and result in scores that can be used to compare candidates. Remember I told you about the interview that Boise Cascade did with us, and that was, hey, tell me about your work life for the next hour, tell me about all the jobs you've ever had, or whatever you want to talk about. Notice what a bitch that is to score, right? Because we might be talking different candidates about entirely different things. Much more difficult to score. The scoring becomes more subjective, and then it's less effective in rank ordering the candidate. So speaking of scoring then, in scoring the structured interviews, critical incident technique can be one basis for scoring, and as we've suggested, you know, the interview responses that characterize poor response to critical incidents for the bottom end, and scoring of rubric, while those who characterize superior can serve as comparison elements for the high end, and then you kind of just grade the interim, right? Incumbents and SMEs can be used as a source of potential response options developing the scoring rubric. So note that when you're interviewing incumbents, when you're interviewing SMEs as part of the job analysis portion, you might actually be thinking about in terms of collecting information that can provide you with a scoring rubric down the road. So it's good to know the full picture so you can take component pieces that you might need later in your process and have them available to you. Okay. The repertory grid's great for organizing method of determining competencies, and also useful source in locating interviewee incumbents to develop the scoring rubric. And let me present you with an example, because this is one that's come up in this class a couple times. And let's suppose we're asking an interviewee for a teaching position this question. And we say, okay, so we often see that teachers employ group work. You might say, is this something you've done before? And we found that one complaint students consistently have about doing group work is that somebody doesn't carry their share of the water, they don't pull their own weight. And then give them a scenario that describes that situation, or a team member is not carrying their own weight, the students are complaining about that, and then you ask, how would you handle that? See, that's a great question, right? And with a well-designed scoring rubric, we can see if the person has ever done it before, number one, and number two, do they handle it in a way that we would believe would be effective, or that we know that would be effective based on past occurrences. So just as one example, and of course in the assignment, the teaching job that the job that you're going to design the interview for was wide open. That's up for you. But notice the advantage of doing the teaching job is you guys already have a repertory grid, which is a gold mine of information to create the interview questions. Okay? So, behavioral interview question, let's differentiate these a little bit. Tell me about a time you were working on a project you felt was important, but others thought it was a waste of time. What did you do, and what was the result? Notice, this is eliciting comments specifically about the behaviors that someone demonstrated in this situation. And you can see kind of a shallow, kind of impoverished rubric here. Excellent. I pursued the project despite the obstacles because I really believed in it. I wanted the project to succeed, and I tried to find a way around the problem. Okay? The marginal response in this particular example from your book, I continued working on the project, but shifted my focus to other projects that had higher probabilities of success. And then finally, the poor answer, according to this rubric, once I felt that the project had low support, I stopped working on it. So that's the example of a behavioral interview question, and you can model that part of your assignment on that. Now let's contrast that with the situational interview question, right? Imagine that you're currently very busy working on several important projects, firm deadlines, your sponsor, your supervisor brings you a stack of unrelated paperwork to complete that you feel is unrelated to any of your projects. In addition, you're certain that attending to this new paperwork will cause you to miss several project deadlines. What would you do? Notice what we've done is we've crafted a situation in this case, and then we want to look at the responses. And the three graded responses here on a 5-point scale, which we know we're not going to do because every point on a scale has to have an explanation of what it means to increase our reliability of the people using the scale. The excellent response in this example: explain the conflict to my supervisor, try to identify and discuss alternatives. It would be important to me to ensure that any changes were acceptable to both my manager and myself. And that's not a bad response, right? The middle range response: tell my supervisor about the conflict, but maybe not offer any kind of solution, right? Poor: accept the conflict as part of the job and do the best I can. Okay. So that illuminates now. Let's talk about the STAR technique. And this is a technique for answering behavioral interview questions. So now we're going to flip it around because I know many of you will be applying for jobs like all of us have. So the STAR technique. Knowing the types of questions you might be asked and how to handle them can really give you a leg up in the interview process, because most people are not systematic about scoring them, so it's a pretty easy system to do well in, right? Technique for answering behavioral interview questions: situation or task, that's the ST. Describe in enough detail for the interviewer to understand the situation and what you needed to accomplish. So if they give you a very vague question, which is not something we would want to design in this class, tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle at work. What kind of obstacle? In what domain? You know, I mean, that's a shitty question, but you may be asked that question, so what are you going to do? Well, describe the situation or task. Don't belabor it, but describe it with enough detail so that it's clear. And going into an interview, anticipate that someone might ask you that type of question and have a pre-prepared response, right? Then you describe the action you took and the results you achieved. So this was the situation, this is the action I took, and these were the results. Super clear, super quick, and will impress interviewers, right? Now what can we learn from this on being on the other end, being the interviewer rather than the interviewee? Is design questions that elicit this type of response. So give your interviewee a little structure, you know, give them a break and ask them a question in a way that they can answer it successfully and concisely. Right? And also notice that it will make it easier to design your scoring rubric. So here's just a little diagram of the STAR technique as described. Describe the event you were in, explain the task you had to complete, the action you took, the result, and then, okay, but the first step in this, of course, is prepare, as I just admonished. Please prepare for this. So, STAR technique example then, what do we know? Well, this would be, I was part of a customer service team. We experienced poor customer satisfaction. Several customer complaints were due to the inconsistency of the levels of service. So that was the situation. The task I took on, being one of the most senior team members, I was asked to propose ideas on how to improve the situation. So that's the eliciting task. What was my action? First, I reviewed the results of customer surveys, used data, isn't that awesome? And collected further data on what the dissatisfaction was about. Then I called a meeting with my peers and asked for their input through brainstorming. So now I'm demonstrating that I'm a collaborative type leader, right? Finally, I came up with a list of 5 ideas to implement changes. And the only thing that I might take issue with in this example is, I think I would maybe say finally we came up with a list of 5 ideas. And the number of complaints, then this is the result, decreased by 20%. Okay? So, questions about that? And remember, questions can always be written down and brought to our Zoom meeting the next time. Now this I-we thing, let me just tell a little story about that and kind of the importance here that I place on this. When I was working at the lumber mill, and I'd finally worked my way up to being the sticking machine operator, so I'd gone from the guy out on the catwalk to the brakeman, and now I'm the sticking machine operator who's ultimately responsible for production of that system, right? That's who they always look to first if production is good or bad. I was training a brakeman, a new brakeman, and he just wasn't getting it. He wasn't, and it's a job I'd done before, so I was capable of training, but this poor guy just didn't do it well, and he kept making these mistakes that would cost us maybe an hour and a half's worth of production at a given time. So that's like a 10-20% drop in production. And this was important. The boss would come back to me, right? And there's also a lot of damage being done to the lumber in this situation because of the mistakes this poor guy was making. And I was incensed, and the boss, remember my boss, John Woods, came yeah, at the lumber mill, and he brought me into the office because he had a complaint from the brakeman. And he said, the brakeman is no longer willing to work with you. Yeah, he really said that about me, and that was really an eye-opener. And he said that you're just not giving him a fair break. And I went on then to, you know, the boss gave me an answer to respond, and I started saying, well, you know, I'm trying to do this, and I did this, and I'm trying to do this, and I'm trying to do that. And after about 3 or 4 minutes of this explanation, I was finished, and Woods looked at me and he said, you done? And I said, yeah. And he said, look, all I've heard for the last 5 minutes of your explanation is I. Never once did you use the word we. He said, I'm trying to operate a team here, and you look like the Lone Ranger. And boy, at that point, he really crushed me. And he was right, and that's why it was such a crushing blow, because I stepped back and said, oh my God, what am I, like the most narcissistic, conceited person on the planet? And it really changed my thinking. It was one of those seminal moments in my life where I said, wow, that is not something I'm going to do in the future. So I like to respond with we. So that's how I would change this answer. When it goes bad, general rule, when it goes bad, my fault. I did this wrong. When it goes well, we is a great response, right? I think. And The only exception to this, I remember, because I'd learned this lesson years and years before, when I was writing my dissertation, and I turned my first chapter into Marilyn, and Marilyn said, so you got to change something here. And I said, what do I have to change? I said, I expect to change a lot of things, but what are you talking about specifically? And she says, every place that you put we, you have to go back in and change it to I. And I said, and I told her the story, and she said, that's all well and good, but in this environment, in the academic environment, this is your dissertation, so I is the appropriate language to use. But other than that, if you're not doing a dissertation, I think I would invoke the we conversation. I think you're better off, and I think you're going to smell better at the end of the interview or whatever. So we makes you look like a leader, it makes you look like a team player, preference, and then be sensitive to that as well when you're hiring. Okay. Anyway, enough of that. Let's call it good for part one, and then we'll go on to part two. Part two is going to be more on competencies, so it's actually called submodule 3.121, if you will, if you like being that technical.